There are things people carry their whole lives without ever setting down, not because they forget they're carrying them, but because the carrying has become so natural, so woven into the fabric of who they are, that they no longer feel the weight. And then, one day, someone notices. Not the weight itself, that stays invisible, but the way the person moves, the way they never seem to stumble, the way difficulty arrives in their life and finds nowhere to take hold, the way they stand in rooms where other people are worried and manage, somehow, to look like they already know how this ends. Margaret noticed it first. She wouldn't have called it anything, wouldn't have used any particular word for what she was observing, but she felt it, the way you feel a change in the air before rain, something in the atmosphere of Dorothy's house, something in the quality of Dorothy's steadiness that didn't quite match what Margaret knew about their circumstances. Earl drove a delivery truck. The house was modest. The neighborhood was the same working-class street they'd all grown up knowing. There was nothing about the arithmetic of Dorothy's life that should have added up to this particular brand of unshakable calm that Dorothy wore the way other women wore their Sunday coats. What was she really doing in that house? What had she been doing, quietly, for all these years? By the time Margaret started asking herself that question seriously, Dorothy had already been doing it for a decade. And the answer, when it finally began to emerge, not all at once, but in pieces, the way the truth usually surfaces, was both simpler and more remarkable than anyone who knew Dorothy would have expected. Stay with this story, because what we're going to uncover in this part of Dorothy's life is not just a habit or a system or a clever trick for stretching a dollar. It's a philosophy, a complete and coherent way of understanding what money actually is, what security actually means, and what a woman with limited income and unlimited discipline can build over the course of an ordinary American life, quietly, invisibly, without ever once announcing what she was doing.
If you're just joining this series, here is what you need to know. Dorothy Aldrich was a homemaker in early 1960s America, living on her husband Earl's single income, raising 2 children in a modest house on a quiet street. In previous parts of this story, we've seen her pantry systems, her ledger, her quiet management of household uncertainty. We've seen how she absorbed financial pressure before it could become visible to the people she loved. What we haven't yet seen is the full picture, the layer beneath the layer, the thing Dorothy was building that even Earl didn't entirely understand. That is what Part 4 is about. And if you've stayed with this series because it reminds you of something real, a woman you knew, a household you remember, a way of living that seems to have quietly disappeared, consider subscribing before we go further, because there are many more stories like Dorothy's buried in the ordinary lives of women who were never famous and never meant to be. Subscribing is how you make sure you don't miss them.
There is a concept that financial thinkers sometimes discuss, the idea that true security is not the absence of difficulty, but the presence of options. The person who has options when difficulty arrives is fundamentally different from the person who does not, even if their income is identical. Options come from preparation. They come from the slow, patient accumulation of small margins, a little more than you need here, a little held back there, a decision deferred today so that a decision tomorrow can be made freely rather than frantically. Dorothy understood this. She had understood it for so long that she no longer thought of it as a concept. It was simply how she lived. But the understanding had not arrived fully formed. It had come the way most real understanding comes, through experience, through observation, through the particular education available to women of her generation who paid close attention to the lives around them and drew their own conclusions from what they saw. The first time Dorothy had truly grasped the power of a financial margin, a real margin, not just a week's worth of extra flour, but something more deliberate, more structured, she had been 26 years old. It was the winter of 1957, 3 years into her marriage, and a woman on the next block named Helen Paulson had found herself in the kind of trouble that comes when a husband loses work and the household has no cushion beneath it. Dorothy hadn't known Helen well. They exchanged pleasantries at the post office, recognized each other at the market. But she had watched, from the particular proximity of a small neighborhood, how quickly Helen's life changed in the weeks after her husband's layoff. The changes weren't dramatic. They were small, the kind of small that is only visible to someone paying attention. The Paulson children stopped appearing at the Saturday afternoon matinee. The curtains in the front room stayed closed on days when the others on the street had theirs open. Helen began timing her appearances at the market to the hour just before closing, when the marked-down items were most accessible. Dorothy watched all of this without saying a word about it to anyone, including Earl. But she thought about it constantly. She thought about it the way you think about something that has arrived with a message specifically for you, something that wasn't meant as instruction, but functions as instruction anyway. What she saw in Helen Paulson's life was not weakness or failure. What she saw was the cost of a missing margin, a gap of perhaps $200 or $300, held somewhere accessible, not spent, not allocated to anything specific, that would have meant the difference between Helen's curtains being open and closed that February. $200 or $300 was not a small amount of money in 1957. For a household like the Aldriches, on Earl's delivery driver wages, it represented several weeks of careful saving. But Dorothy had looked at Helen's closed curtains and decided, quietly and permanently, that the cost of building that margin was considerably lower than the cost of not having it. She began building it the following month. Now here is where the story becomes interesting, where it moves past the ordinary and into something that, once you see it, you can't quite unsee. Dorothy did not build her margin the way most people would have attempted to build it. She did not simply set aside whatever was left at the end of each month, because she had learned early that what is left at the end of a month is almost always less than expected, and sometimes nothing at all. The end of the month is too late. By the time you reach it, the decisions have already been made, the money has already moved, and the margin you intended to save has become the dinner you bought on a difficult Thursday, or the small repair that couldn't wait. She built it from the front of the month, not the back. Before any other allocation was made, before groceries, before utilities, before the envelope for household expenses, Dorothy moved a fixed amount into what she thought of, in the privacy of her own mind, as the foundation. Not the reserve, which was her emergency cushion and operated differently. The foundation was something else, something longer. Something she had decided in the winter of 1957, after watching Helen Paulson's curtains, would not be touched for reasons smaller than genuine necessity. The amount varied by month depending on circumstances. She was too practical to be rigid about a number when rigidity might do harm. But the habit was inflexible. The foundation was always first. It was the first line she wrote in the ledger at the start of every new month, before she calculated anything else. Whatever the number was that month, $2, $5, on a good month perhaps 8 or 10, it was written first, set aside first, and the rest of the month's planning built around whatever remained. This is the discipline that almost no one talks about when they talk about saving money. Not the amount, the sequence. The decision to treat the future as the first obligation rather than the last hope, to pay the foundation before you pay for anything else, including comfort, including convenience, including the small luxuries that feel like necessities by the time the end of the month arrives. Dorothy had arrived at this principle not from a book or an advice column or any formal instruction. She had arrived at it through the same process she arrived at most of her understanding, by observing carefully, by thinking without interruption in the early morning hours before the house woke up, and by asking herself a question she returned to often. What does the person who never ends up in trouble do differently from the person who does? The answer, as best she could determine from a lifetime of close observation, was not income. It was not luck, though luck played its part. It was sequence. The stable people she knew treated security as the first expense rather than the last hope. Everyone else did it the other way around, and the results, over time, were entirely predictable. Margaret had come over on a Wednesday afternoon in early spring of 1963. One of those pale, tentative March days when the cold hasn't quite released its hold, but you can feel it considering it. She'd come to return a roasting pan she'd borrowed in February and stayed, as Margaret often did, for coffee and conversation at Dorothy's table. They had been friends long enough that the silences between them were comfortable, which is one of the more accurate measures of a genuine friendship. Margaret talked more than Dorothy, which suited them both. She brought news of the neighborhood, observations about people and events, the running commentary of a woman who was genuinely interested in the world around her. Dorothy listened, asked occasional questions, and offered her own observations in the measured, careful way she did everything. That afternoon, Margaret had been talking about the Hendersons down the street. Jim Henderson had been passed over for a promotion he'd expected, and the household was apparently adjusting to the disappointment in various visible ways. A planned vacation had been quietly canceled. A new car that Jim had been discussing since the previous fall had not materialized. Margaret conveyed all of this with the sympathetic concern of someone who genuinely cared, but couldn't quite suppress the faint human interest in observing other people's difficulties. "It just goes to show," Margaret said, wrapping both hands around her coffee cup. "You think things are secure, and then one decision somewhere, one person in some office, and everything shifts." Dorothy was quiet for a moment. Outside the window, a pair of sparrows were disputing ownership of the hedge along the side yard with considerable energy. "That's why you can't let security live in someone else's decision," Dorothy said finally. Margaret looked at her. "What do you mean?" Dorothy considered how to say it. She was not by nature a woman who explained her thinking unprompted. The philosophy she carried was mostly internal, mostly private, mostly expressed through action rather than words. But Margaret had asked a direct question, and Dorothy had a direct answer. "If your security depends entirely on whether Jim Henderson gets the promotion," she said, "then Jim Henderson's boss is actually the one running your household, not you." She paused. "I decided a long time ago that I wanted to be the one running ours." Margaret was quiet for a moment in the way people go quiet when something simple has landed with unexpected weight. "But how?" she said. "On what Earl makes?" Dorothy lifted her coffee cup. "1 month at a time," she said, "starting from the front." She didn't explain further, and Margaret didn't ask, but something shifted in that kitchen that afternoon. A small, quiet shift, the kind that doesn't announce itself and isn't visible except in retrospect. Margaret drove home afterward thinking about Jim Henderson's boss and about whether there was a sense in which she had, without ever quite examining it, handed the running of her own household to a series of people and institutions and decisions that had nothing specifically to do with her family's well-being. It was an uncomfortable thought. She set it aside for the moment, but it came back. The foundation, by the spring of 1963, had been building for 6 years. Dorothy had not spoken of it to Earl in any specific terms. This is not to say she had hidden it from him. The ledger was always there, always available, and Earl had never been a man who needed to examine it to trust what was in it. But she had not drawn his attention to the particular line at the top of each month's page, had not explained the distinction between the reserve and what she thought of as the foundation, had not said in so many words, "I am building something here that is separate from our emergency fund, something intended not for crises, but for the long future, for the day when options matter more than anything else." She had not said it because it was difficult to say without sounding as though she expected something to go wrong, and she did not expect something to go wrong. She was not building the foundation from fear. This was the part that would have been hardest to explain to anyone who hadn't already understood it. The distinction between preparing because you are afraid and preparing because you are free enough to think about the future without panic. Fear-based saving looks the same from the outside as disciplined saving, but it feels entirely different from the inside, and over time it produces different results. Fear-based saving is reactive. It responds to anxiety, fluctuates with mood, gets rated when the anxiety momentarily subsides and something desirable appears. Disciplined saving is structural. It exists independent of how you feel on any given day, independent of whether the anxiety is present or absent, independent of whether the future feels threatening or benign. Dorothy's saving was structural. She had decided the foundation existed and what it was for, and then she had simply continued making that decision every month, regardless of how she felt. On the months when the household ran tight, the foundation contribution was smaller. On the months when it ran easy, it was larger, but the decision to contribute, that never varied. What was it for? This is the question that hovered at the edges of Dorothy's thinking for years without ever quite needing a definitive answer. She had general ideas: security, options, the ability to absorb something truly large if something truly large arrived. She thought about Clara's education vaguely as one of the things the foundation might one day address. She thought about the possibility of Earl's health changing as he aged, which she noted in the ledger simply as health contingency, without dwelling on it. She thought about the simple, irreducible value of having a sum of money that was large enough to make a real decision with, not the reserve, which was meant to absorb the expected unexpected, but something that could absorb the genuinely unforeseeable. She did not think about it in the way a financial planner might, with projections and target numbers and planned withdrawal dates. She thought about it the way a woman who has lived carefully thinks about the future, as something that will arrive regardless and that deserves to be met with resources rather than empty hands. By early 1963, those resources had grown to a number that would have surprised almost everyone who knew the Aldrich household. Not dramatically. Dorothy was not a woman who dramatized anything, but the number in the foundation, the accumulated result of 6 years of taking from the front before allocating to anything else, of keeping the line item there at the top of the page every single month without exception, had become genuinely meaningful. It had crossed the threshold from a cushion into something that offered real choices. She had not celebrated this crossing. She had noted it in the ledger with the same small, precise handwriting she used for everything, and then she had turned the page and begun the next month's allocation. But she knew what the number meant. She understood, in the clear and practical way she understood most things, that a household with that foundation behind it was a materially different household than it had been 6 years earlier. Not in its visible circumstances, not in its address or its furniture or the car in the driveway, but in its actual freedom, in the range of choices available to it, in what it could absorb, what it could do, what it could walk away from if walking away was the right decision. This is what the magazines and the advertisements and the whole apparatus of 1960s American consumer culture could not sell you and could not replicate no matter how many installment plans it offered: genuine freedom of decision, the freedom that comes not from having more things, but from owing nothing, from having prepared for enough possibilities that the future feels navigable rather than threatening. Dorothy had been building that freedom for 6 years, 1 month's front of the ledger line at a time, and she had done it without anyone around her fully understanding what she was doing. There was an afternoon in April, one of those first genuinely warm afternoons after a long winter, when people open their windows and the neighborhood exchanges its particular indoor silence for something more alive. When Dorothy sat at the table with the ledger open and did something she rarely allowed herself. She looked backward. Not at the individual months, not at the specific numbers and adjustments and small decisions recorded in her careful hand. She looked at the accumulation, at what the sum of all those months added up to, at the distance between where she'd begun in that February of 1957 after watching Helen Paulson's curtains close, and where she was now. She sat with it for a while. Outside, she could hear Tommy playing in the side yard. He was 10 now, his voice carrying the particular energy of a boy who has been indoors too long and is making up for it. Clara was at a friend's house down the street. Earl was on his route. The house was as quiet as it got, and the April light came through the window at an angle that made everything in the room look slightly more significant than it usually did. Dorothy looked at the number. She thought about Helen Paulson, whose husband had eventually found work and whose curtains had reopened sometime in the spring of 1958. She thought about Margaret, who had gone home from that Wednesday afternoon coffee turning something over in her mind that she hadn't quite put into words. She thought about Clara, who was 7 now and drawing constantly, and had recently informed Dorothy with considerable seriousness that she intended to study art when she grew up, and who had always deserved, the realistic possibility that her mother could say yes to that instead of "we'll see." She thought about Earl, who worked hard every day on a route that was not easy, who trusted her completely with the household accounts, who had no idea that the ledger open in front of her contained a line that represented now a genuine and substantial resource. She would tell him, she decided. Not today. Today she wanted to sit with it quietly, to let the moment exist before it became a conversation. But soon. Because what she'd built was not a secret, not in the way that secrets are shameful or concealing. It was a gift. It was something she had made out of ordinary circumstances and extraordinary consistency, and it belonged to both of them. It had simply required one of them to build it. There was an afternoon in April, one of those first genuinely warm afternoons after a long winter, when people open their windows and the neighborhood exchanges its particular indoor silence for something more alive, when Dorothy sat at the table with the ledger open and did something she rarely allowed herself. She looked backward. Not at the individual months, not at the specific numbers and adjustments and small decisions recorded in her careful hand. She looked at the accumulation, at what the sum of all those months added up to, at the distance between where she'd begun in that February of 1957 after watching Helen Paulson's curtains close, and where she was now. She sat with it for a while. Outside, she could hear Tommy playing in the side yard. He was 10 now, his voice carrying the particular energy of a boy who has been indoors too long and is making up for it. Clara was at a friend's house down the street. Earl was on his route. The house was as quiet as it got, and the April light came through the window at an angle that made everything in the room look slightly more significant than it usually did. Dorothy looked at the number. She thought about Helen Paulson, whose husband had eventually found work and whose curtains had reopened sometime in the spring of 1958. She thought about Margaret, who had gone home from that Wednesday afternoon coffee turning something over in her mind that she hadn't quite put into words. She thought about Clara, who was 7 now and drawing constantly, and had recently informed Dorothy with considerable seriousness that she intended to study art when she grew up, and who had always deserved, the realistic possibility that her mother could say yes to that instead of "we'll see." She thought about Earl, who worked hard every day on a route that was not easy, who trusted her completely with the household accounts, who had no idea that the ledger open in front of her contained a line that represented now a genuine and substantial resource. She would tell him, she decided. Not today. Today she wanted to sit with it quietly, to let the moment exist before it became a conversation. But soon. Because what she'd built was not a secret, not in the way that secrets are shameful or concealing. It was a gift. It was something she had made out of ordinary circumstances and extraordinary consistency, and it belonged to both of them. It had simply required one of them to build it. There is something worth saying, before this part of the story moves toward its close, about the particular invisibility of the kind of work Dorothy did. We have spent a great deal of time in recent generations developing language for the things that people do that are visible, for income, for career achievement, for accumulation of the measurable and the publicly verifiable. We are less practiced at finding language for the things that happen before any of that is possible. The decisions made at kitchen tables before dawn, the habits maintained without applause or acknowledgement, the long, patient, entirely unspectacular process of building a foundation beneath a family's life, so that when difficulty arrives, and it always arrives, there is something to stand on. Dorothy did not have language for what she was doing. She didn't need it. She was doing it. But we might need language for it now, because we have largely lost the habit and largely forgotten what the loss costs. We live in a world that has made it easier than it has ever been to spend money that doesn't exist on things that don't matter, and harder than it should be to find the patience and the structure to build a genuine margin beneath our lives. The tools Dorothy used, a composition notebook, a pencil, an envelope, the discipline of writing a number at the top of a page before any other number was written, are still available. They cost almost nothing. They require only the decision that Margaret finally understood that winter, sitting across a table from her neighbor, holding a borrowed pan. The decision that security is something you build, not something that arrives. Dorothy's foundation, by the end of 1963, was large enough to matter in ways that hadn't yet been tested. It would be tested. The story is not finished, and the parts of it still to come will ask Dorothy and the foundation she built to do things that 6 years of patient accumulation had made possible, but not guaranteed. Because preparation, as Dorothy herself understood, is not a promise, it is a posture. It is the best available answer to the uncertainty of a future that no one can fully predict or fully control. She knew that. She had always known that. But she also knew something that the unprepared don't get to know, the particular quality of confidence available to a person who has done the work in advance, who has sat at the table in the early morning, month after month, and made the decision to take from the front, who has looked at the accumulated result of that decision and understood in a way that goes past words that they have given themselves and the people they love something real. Not a guarantee, never a guarantee, a foundation. And in the particular arithmetic of an ordinary American life, that distinction between having one and not having one is everything. There is still more of Dorothy's story to tell. There are decisions ahead that the foundation will have to meet, and conversations that will finally bring into the open what has been quietly built over years, and moments that will ask Dorothy to be something other than simply prepared, something that preparation, for all its power, cannot quite replace. That is what Part 5 will carry. But before we get there, take a moment with what you've learned in this part of the story. Think about the sequencing in your own life. Think about whether security lives in someone else's decision in ways you haven't fully examined. Think about what it would mean to take from the front, even a small amount, even a very small amount, before anything else is allocated. Dorothy didn't start with a large number. She started with the decision. If this story has made you think about your own habits, your own household, the women in your life who may have been doing something like this without ever naming it, leave a comment below, because these conversations matter, and the wisdom in them belongs to all of us. If you haven't subscribed yet, this is a good moment. Part 5 is coming, and what happens next in Dorothy's life is the part of the story that brings everything she built into the open. You don't want to come in late. And if someone in your life would recognize Dorothy, would see in her the shape of a woman they once knew, or a habit they once watched without understanding, share this video with them, because some stories are better received when they arrive from someone who thought of you while watching. Like this video if Dorothy's story has stayed with you, and we'll see you in Part 5.